Welcome to the Trackpads podcast, your go-to destination for exploring the rich history, strategies, and leadership lessons of warfare. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Edwards. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast and sign up for the weekly newsletter. You can also explore my published books and more by visiting trackpads.com. Let's get started. The Vietnam War, America's War. The Vietnam War remains one of the most complex and controversial conflicts in American history, shaping the nation's military, politics, and society in ways still felt today. Rooted in Cold War tensions and the fight against communist expansion, the war drew the United States into a prolonged and costly struggle in Southeast Asia. What began as a limited advisory role escalated into full-scale military intervention, with strategies, battles, and political decisions that would define an era. At home, the war ignited widespread protest, distrust in government, and a crisis of national identity, while abroad it altered America's approach to warfare and diplomacy. Understanding Vietnam requires an in-depth look at its origins, key battles, domestic impact, and long-term legacy, lessons that continue to influence U.S. military and foreign policy to this day. Origins and causes. For much of its history, Vietnam was under the control of foreign powers, most notably the French, who ruled it as part of French Indochina from the late 19th century. French colonial rule was marked by economic exploitation and political repression, sparking growing resentment among the Vietnamese population. By the early 20th century, nationalist movements seeking independence gained traction, but it was World War II that created the perfect storm for revolutionary change. The Japanese occupation of Vietnam during the war weakened French authority, and when Japan surrendered in 1945, the power vacuum left behind gave Vietnamese revolutionaries a critical opportunity. Among them, Ho Chi Minh, a Marxist revolutionary and nationalist leader, seized the moment, declaring Vietnam's independence and forming the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh had long been involved in anti-colonial efforts, drawing inspiration from both communist ideology and Vietnam's history of resisting foreign rule. During World War II, his forces, known as the Viet Minh, received covert support from the United States as part of their shared fight against Japan. However, after the war, France attempted to reclaim its former colony, leading to a bloody struggle known as the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh, using guerrilla tactics and leveraging widespread local support, eventually defeated the French, culminating in their decisive victory at Dien Bien Phu. This forced France to negotiate, leading to the Geneva Accords of 1954, which divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The agreement established North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and a U.S.-backed South Vietnam under President Ngo Dinh. The division of Vietnam was not just a geographic split, but a reflection of Cold War ideological tensions between communism and democracy. The U.S., fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, quickly moved to bolster the South Vietnamese government with economic aid and military advisors. This was based on the Domino Theory, a widely held belief in Washington that if one nation in a region fell to communism, others would inevitably follow. The Soviet Union and China, meanwhile, provided significant backing to North Vietnam, turning the country into a Cold War battleground. South Vietnam, however, faced internal instability, as Diem's government was deeply unpopular due to corruption, repression, and religious discrimination. His inability to win the support of his people made the country vulnerable to communist insurgency, and the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force allied with the North, gained momentum in their fight to undermine the South's authority. American involvement escalated dramatically following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, a controversial event that served as the catalyst for direct U.S. military intervention. Reports indicated that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, leading to retaliatory airstrikes. Though the details of the incident remained debated, it provided President Lyndon Johnson with the justification to seek broad congressional authorization for military action. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed almost unanimously, granted the president authority to use military force without a formal declaration of war. This marked the beginning of full-scale U.S. involvement, with American troops pouring into Vietnam and the war escalating into one of the most complex and controversial conflicts in U.S. history. Military strategies and tactics. The U.S. military entered Vietnam with a strategy rooted in attrition warfare, aiming to wear down the enemy through superior firepower and relentless engagement. Commanders measured success not in territory gained but in enemy casualties, leading to the controversial body count metric, which often distorted the reality of the war. To pressure North Vietnam into submission, the U.S. launched extensive bombing campaigns, most notably Operation Rolling Thunder, which saw sustained aerial bombardment of enemy targets over several years. The idea was to cripple North Vietnam's industry and supply lines, but the decentralized nature of the enemy's war effort made total destruction impossible. Instead of breaking their will, the bombing campaigns hardened Vietnamese resolve, and despite dropping millions of tons of explosives, the U.S. struggled to translate firepower into victory. One of the defining elements of the Vietnam War was the extensive use of advanced weaponry, particularly helicopters, which became essential for mobility in the dense jungles and rough terrain. The UH-1 Huey helicopter, for example, revolutionized troop movement, medical evacuations, and rapid assaults on enemy positions. Alongside helicopters, the U.S. deployed chemical weapons, such as napalm, a jellied gasoline used to burn through thick vegetation in enemy hideouts, and Agent Orange, a defoliant meant to strip the jungle and expose Viet Cong supply routes. However, the unintended consequences of these weapons were devastating, as Agent Orange caused long-term health effects for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. While technology gave the U.S. an undeniable advantage, it was not enough to counter the adaptability and resilience of the enemy forces, who operated under entirely different combat principles. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army relied on guerrilla warfare, a strategy designed to nullify America's technological superiority through stealth, ambushes, and hit-and-run attacks. Their knowledge of the terrain allowed them to move quickly and disappear into the dense jungles, frustrating conventional U.S. forces trained for more traditional battlefield engagements. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, an extensive network of jungle paths stretching through Laos and Cambodia, served as a vital supply line that kept the North Vietnamese war machine operational despite heavy U.S. bombing. The Viet Cong also made effective use of underground tunnel systems, allowing them to launch attacks and then vanish before American forces could respond. These tactics, combined with widespread local support, made the insurgency extremely difficult to root out, forcing the U.S. military into a war of endurance it was unprepared to fight. The Tet Offensive was a turning point in the war, as North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a coordinated series of surprise attacks on cities, military bases, and the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. While the offensive ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives and resulted in massive enemy casualties, it dealt a severe psychological blow to American public opinion. Up until that point, the Johnson administration had assured the public that victory was within reach, but the intensity of the Tet Offensive shattered this illusion. Images of street fighting in Saigon and the sheer scale of the attacks convinced many Americans that the war was unwinnable. Even though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the offensive, the shift in perception was irreversible, fueling anti-war sentiment and ultimately changing the course of American policy. Fighting in the dense jungles of Vietnam presented enormous challenges for U.S. troops, who were often at a disadvantage despite their superior firepower. The oppressive heat, thick vegetation, and monsoon rains made movement difficult, while booby traps and ambushes turned even the most routine patrols into life-or-death encounters. Unlike past conflicts where clear battle lines were drawn, Vietnam was a war without front lines, and soldiers could never be certain where the enemy lurked. Even worse, the ideological dedication of the Viet Cong and NVA meant they were willing to sustain enormous casualties to achieve their goal of reunification under communist rule. For many American soldiers, the war became an exhausting and demoralizing experience, as victories in battle rarely translated into progress toward ending the conflict. Key events and turning points. American involvement in Vietnam escalated significantly under Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, as both leaders saw the conflict as a critical battleground in the Cold War struggle against communism. Kennedy increased the number of military advisors in South Vietnam, providing support to President Ngo Diem's government, but the situation deteriorated due to Diem's unpopular policies and growing unrest. After Diem's assassination in 1963, the South Vietnamese government remained unstable, and Johnson inherited a worsening crisis. The Gulf of Tonkin incident gave Johnson the political backing to commit U.S. combat troops, leading to a full-scale war effort. By 1965, American ground forces were engaged in direct combat, with troop numbers rising dramatically as the administration pursued a strategy of sustained military pressure to defeat the communist insurgents. The war was defined by several major battles that tested both American firepower and the resilience of North Vietnamese forces. The Battle of Ia Drang Valley in 1965 was the first large-scale engagement between U.S. troops and the North Vietnamese Army, showcasing the effectiveness of air mobility and artillery, but also revealing the enemy's ability to inflict heavy casualties. The Siege of Khe Sanh in 1968 was another pivotal moment, with U.S. Marines holding out against a prolonged North Vietnamese assault that was seen as a potential replay of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. However, the most significant battle of 1968 was the Siege of Hue during the Tet Offensive, where North Vietnamese forces seized the historic city, engaging in brutal urban combat before being driven out. These battles demonstrated the war's intensity and the high cost of fighting an enemy willing to sustain enormous losses to achieve its goals. The draft played a critical role in shaping public perception of the war, as young men across America found themselves called to serve in an increasingly unpopular conflict. Unlike previous wars where conscription was widely accepted, Vietnam's draft system disproportionately affected lower-income and minority communities, while many wealthier Americans secured deferments through college enrollment or other means. This led to widespread resentment and fueled the anti-war movement, with protests erupting on college campuses and in major cities. The draft also contributed to declining morale among troops, as many draftees viewed their service as forced participation in a war with unclear objectives. As casualties mounted, opposition to the war grew, forcing political leaders to reevaluate their approach and ultimately leading to the policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to shift the burden of combat to South Vietnamese forces, while gradually reducing American involvement. By the early 1970s, the U.S. sought an exit from Vietnam, culminating in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. The agreement, negotiated under President Richard Nixon, called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American troops, and the return of prisoners of war. While the accords allowed the U.S. to disengage, they did little to secure South Vietnam's long-term survival. Despite continued American aid, the South Vietnamese government struggled to defend itself against renewed North Vietnamese offensives. The situation deteriorated rapidly, and by 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final push toward Saigon, overwhelming the South Vietnamese military. The fall of Saigon in April of 1975 marked the dramatic and symbolic end of the Vietnam War, as communist forces stormed the city, capturing the presidential palace and securing total control. In the final hours, American personnel and South Vietnamese allies desperately fled, with images of helicopters evacuating people from the U.S. Embassy becoming some of the most iconic moments of the war. With the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule, the conflict ended in a decisive victory for the North, cementing the war as one of the most humbling chapters in American military history. For many in the U.S., the fall of Saigon was a painful confirmation that years of effort, sacrifice, and loss had ultimately failed to prevent a communist takeover. In domestic impact in the United States, the Vietnam War ignited one of the most significant anti-war movements in American history, as growing numbers of citizens took to the streets in protest. What began as isolated demonstrations on college campuses in the early 1960s escalated into nationwide marches, sit-ins, and acts of civil disobedience. The draft was a major source of outrage, as young men, many of whom had no say in the political decisions that led to the war, were sent to fight and die in a conflict with unclear objectives. Opposition intensified after the Tet Offensive, when it became clear that the government's optimistic reports of progress did not match the reality on the ground. Protests became more aggressive, with incidents like the Kent State shooting in 1970, where National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed students, further deepening the divide between the government and the public. The role of the media in shaping public perception of the war cannot be overstated, as Vietnam was the first major conflict to be extensively televised. Unlike previous wars where information was tightly controlled, reporters had unprecedented access to the front lines, bringing the brutal realities of combat into American living rooms. Graphic footage of napalm bombings, wounded soldiers, and civilian casualties painted a stark contrast to official government statements claiming progress. The My Lai massacre, in which American troops killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, became a defining scandal when images and first-hand accounts surfaced, shattering public trust in the military's conduct. As journalists uncovered more inconsistencies between political rhetoric and battlefield conditions, Americans grew increasingly skeptical of their leaders, fueling opposition to the war and demands for withdrawal. For those who served, returning home from Vietnam was often as traumatic as the war itself, as veterans faced widespread indifference, hostility, and a lack of support. Unlike previous wars where returning soldiers were celebrated as heroes, Vietnam veterans were met with protests, sometimes even being blamed for the war itself. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that was poorly understood at the time, leaving them to suffer in silence. The government's failure to adequately support these veterans compounded their difficulties, as many found themselves dealing with unemployment, homelessness, and social alienation. The stigma surrounding their service persisted for years, and only decades later did the nation begin to fully acknowledge their sacrifices, with efforts to provide better medical and psychological care through organizations like the Department of Veterans Affairs. Politically, the war eroded public confidence in the government, setting the stage for one of the most turbulent periods in American political history. The release of the Pentagon Papers exposed years of government deception, revealing that officials had privately doubted the war's winnability while publicly insisting on its necessity. This deepened the credibility gap between Washington and the American people, leading to a broader distrust of institutions. The Watergate scandal, which erupted during this same period, further cemented this cynicism, as President Richard Nixon's involvement in covering up political crimes led to his resignation in 1974. By the time the war ended, Americans had become far more skeptical of their leaders, questioning the motives behind military interventions and demanding greater transparency in government affairs. The lessons of Vietnam had a profound effect on American foreign policy, leading to significant legislative changes designed to prevent unchecked military action in the future. The War Powers Act of 1973 was a direct response to the executive overreach seen during the Vietnam era, limiting the president's ability to deploy troops without congressional approval. This shift reflected a broader reluctance to engage in prolonged conflicts, as Vietnam had demonstrated the dangers of committing military force without a clear strategy for victory. The war also influenced how future conflicts were approached, with the U.S. military adopting an all-volunteer force and developing new doctrines that emphasized technological superiority, precision strikes, and limited engagements. While Vietnam did not end American interventionism, it fundamentally altered the way wars were fought and justified, leaving a lasting imprint on the nation's military and political landscape. Legacy and lessons learned. The Vietnam War profoundly reshaped U.S. military doctrine, forcing a reevaluation of how America engages in conflicts, particularly those involving insurgencies. The war exposed the limitations of traditional attrition-based warfare, where success was measured by body counts rather than strategic control of territory or political outcomes. In response, the military developed new counterinsurgency strategies that emphasized winning hearts and minds rather than relying solely on overwhelming firepower. Lessons from Vietnam influenced later conflicts, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan, where understanding local populations, intelligence gathering, and precision strikes became critical elements of modern warfare. Additionally, Vietnam contributed to the shift toward an all-volunteer force, as reliance on a draft had proven politically disastrous and detrimental to morale. One of the most significant lessons from Vietnam was the necessity of understanding the political, cultural, and historical context of a conflict before committing military resources. American leaders failed to grasp the deeply rooted nationalist motivations driving the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, mistakenly viewing the war solely through the lens of the Cold War and communist expansion. Intelligence failures and a lack of cultural awareness led to misguided policies such as supporting corrupt South Vietnamese leaders who had little legitimacy among their own people. Diplomatically, the war underscored the importance of clear objectives and exit strategies, as Vietnam became a cautionary tale of mission creep and unclear goals. Future military engagements would be shaped by a desire to avoid similar quagmires, leading to a more cautious approach to intervention. Despite the war's devastation, U.S.-Vietnam relations eventually shifted from hostility to cooperation, demonstrating how even the most bitter conflicts can give way to reconciliation. After years of diplomatic estrangement, relations began to thaw in the 1990s, leading to the normalization of ties in 1995. Today, Vietnam and the United States maintain strong economic and strategic partnerships, particularly as Vietnam has sought closer ties with the West in response to regional security concerns. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and even military cooperation have replaced decades of animosity, highlighting the resilience of international diplomacy. The war's legacy continues to shape interactions between the two nations, serving as a reminder of the long-term effects of foreign intervention and the possibilities of rebuilding relationships even after intense conflict. At home, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., stands as one of the most powerful tributes to those who served, playing a crucial role in the nation's healing process. Unlike traditional war memorials that emphasize victory, the Vietnam Memorial is a stark, reflective black granite wall, etched with the names of over 58,000 Americans who lost their lives. Its design was initially controversial, but has since become a place of solemn remembrance, allowing veterans and their families to find closure. The memorial represents a broader shift in how the country honors its soldiers, recognizing their sacrifices regardless of the war's political outcome. Over time, it has helped reshape the narrative around Vietnam veterans, replacing the stigma many faced upon their return with a sense of gratitude and respect for their service. The broader implications of the Vietnam War extend well beyond the conflict itself, influencing Cold War strategy and global military engagements for decades to come. The war weakened America's willingness to engage in prolonged conflicts, leading to what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a hesitancy to commit ground troops unless victory was clearly attainable. This cautious approach influenced foreign policy decisions throughout the 1970s and 1980s, including the limited involvement in conflicts like the Soviet-Afghan War and U.S. interventions in Latin America. Vietnam also had a psychological impact on America's global image, challenging its perception as an unstoppable superpower and emboldening other nationalist movements worldwide. While the Cold War continued for another decade and a half, Vietnam proved that military might alone was not enough to guarantee success, forcing a shift in strategy that emphasized diplomacy, intelligence, and more precise military engagements. Conclusion: the Vietnam War left an indelible mark on American history, reshaping military strategy, political trust, and the nation's approach to global conflicts. What began as an effort to contain communism turned into a drawn-out struggle that tested the limits of U.S. military power and the resolve of its people. The war's legacy extends beyond the battlefield, influencing how future wars are fought, how veterans are treated, and how the American public views government transparency in matters of war. Decades later, its lessons continue to shape foreign policy, reminding leaders of the importance of clear objectives, cultural understanding, and the long-term consequences of intervention. While the war remains a subject of debate, its impact is undeniable, offering valuable insights into the costs of conflict and the complexities of global engagement. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Trackpads podcast. Don't forget to check out the Trackpads online newsletter, where we take things to the next level with multimedia content. Each issue features fascinating and informative photos, videos, and articles that bring the stories of military life to you in a dynamic and engaging way. Be sure to subscribe at trackpads.com to stay informed and entertained. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the incredible world of military history and life.